as we sang and drank, toasting each other and sharing tales of one another's valor and guile with our newest comrade Nada. I began to plan what needed to be done before we made sail. Shifting in my chair, I felt that pistol that had been such a perfect temptation to bring me and mine back into this life that we were now preparing to jump back into. I realized one stop I would have to make. As things wound down after an hour or so, I thumped my mug on the table to get the attention of all. Folks, we'll be setting off at 0600 sharp. I want everyone at their stations no later than 0500. Final checks and preparations are to be completed no later than 0545. Until 0500, you are free to tend to any affairs you need to. I will be returning to the ship no later than 0430. Let's not have another frack spar, alright? Nervous chuckled around the table as the seriousness of my words rang through the drink and the merriment. Have I made myself clear? They all responded I had in a solid voice, and I stood to make my way to the translocation chamber, when Nav approached me using his comm drone and addressed me quietly. Sarge, I recommend returning to the ship no later than 0400. May I ask why? I kept my voice low, as Nav was not one to question a timetable without good cause. There are systems you will want to inspect personally before we make way. The extra time will compensate for that, without delaying our departure or roll call. Well, if I need to... The systems will not be ready for inspection until near then anyways, Sarge. So, where would you like me to set the translocation to? If you insist. Outside of Drunkia, I have a mighty thirst to quench. I said last loudly to a roarous response from the crew. As you wish, Sarge. The translocator is ready for you once you are ready. Soon finding myself outside of Drunkia, hearing the loud chorus of shanties and other drunken songs, I smiled. If I only had the time. Instead, I made my way to the skyship dock nearby, and found an elderly goblin sitting behind the desk. He looked up from whatever he was reading to address me. Sorry, son. No flights until the morning. I am aware, but I am also in need of immediate transit to Tranis Station 3, Level 4. I set my payment coin on the counter and slid it to him slowly. His eyes glanced down at my payment and back to me before he slid a hand beneath the counter, and I heard a series of clicks and other sounds of a mechanism being worked. A moment later, in the previously bare wall, portal opened to a dark room with only the moonlight illuminating it. Hearing the goblin slide my payment off the counter, I just chose to walk through the portal, as keeping such things open longer than was needed was not only a waste of energy, it was of little discretion. As the portal snapped shut behind me, I saw that I was in one of many such portal rooms that were around the grounds of Tranis, one that didn't see much use by the looks of it. Making my way out into the sky dock attached to catch a lift deeper into the city, I removed my gloves and tucked them into my belt. From the highly elevated sky dock, I could see vast areas that were in use for training, practice, and drilling. In the distance, I caught sight of an exercise just starting. Looked to be some Year 5s leading an assault to capture a flag from a fortified location and a numerically superior foe. The panel at the dock told me I had a bit to wait before my transport made its way here, so I watched the exercise and shook my head as the assaulting force opened their attack using mass bombardment of fog bank rounds, covering the field and the fortifications with a thick, dense fog that would most likely last until the morning sun burned it off. Even after all these years, the same tools kept being used, almost as if war changed little, if ever. It was a clever tactic, but as the defenders quickly showed, It was just the first steps in this dance. Their response was to deploy a number of magical arrows that landed after a high arc and began to glow a soft arterial red from their feathered ends. While not nearly enough to fully light the flog, their placement was not random, as to avoid light and the shadows that they would cause giving away their position. The attackers would have to stay channeled into the darker, unlit areas. There was obviously some familiarity between these forces, as they were beginning to deploy the counter before the bombardment had even finished. As the transport pulled alongside the dock and extended its ramp for me to board, I saw a flare launch up not 30 feet from the walls, scaring the hell out of the defenders and forcing them to bring their guns to a much closer range instead of aimed at the edge of the forest line where this attack was coming from. As I sat down, the pilot asked if I'd like to observe the test as we made our way in, and as things were just beginning to heat up, it appeared, I confirmed that I would. As we flew towards the center of Tranis, I watched a scattered, heavy fire rake the battlements from pockets in the fog, and one more salvo of fog banks landed behind and onto the wall. The impact caused the walls to collapse where the round struck. The defenders, to their credit, were very fast and kept the attackers pinned in these ambush positions, denying them the opening the damaged wall now offered them. Next, a mighty bolt of lightning then came down at the defenders, seeking to scour them from the breach and end this impasse. However, the defenders' own meta assets countered and rechanneled this mighty bolt into the area where the flare had originally flown up, releasing a huge bloom of light and fire. But no screaming. We were less than halfway to our destination, when suddenly a color-changing light burst into life over the battlefield, signaling the victory of the attackers and the end of the exercise. They had somehow gotten the flag and gotten it back to their base in the chaos of that very short engagement, and seemingly without the defenders being any wiser. Not bad. Not bad at all, the pilot agreed, saying there were more than a few bright talents in the Year 5 tests right now. We made small talk for the last few minutes of the flight, before I disembarked and made my way into the vast complexes of tunnels and chambers beneath the city. Using secret passages that had not been used in some time, I soon found myself alone, walking down a long tunnel to a very old part of the city. As I continued to walk, the hall became dark and formless. "Why are you here, Professor? Why have you returned to this path?" A voice, hollow and shifting, asked. I slid my gloves back on, covering the ring of office that had allowed me to move through the city with such ease. "My business is my own. Now bother me no more, or face me." I had no idea who this was, but I hadn't the time for their pranks. I had a timetable to keep. "You face far worse than I, scale tipper. Far worse." And with that and a soft laugh, the hall returned to form, and I had to take a moment to calm myself. That name struck a tone of dread within me, and honestly, I wasn't ready for what happened next. "Professor Hahn? Is that really you?" A voice that was familiar yet forgotten snapped me from my thoughts violently. Whoa, easy there." Looking down the barrel of my service pistol, and at the end of the hall, I saw the tall, lean form of Professor Canar. The full suit of armor that contained his life force, or whatever that powered him, and smirked. "Good way to lose a faceplate, Canar." Began to lower my pistol, a smile making its way across my face despite my mock seriousness. "Indeed, but we both know you would never shoot a work of art like myself." He tilted his head to the side in mock preening. We had known each other for ages and knew the truth of each other. Therefore, there was only one reply that could be made. True, something so uniquely ugly must be preserved for all of time. The finely wrought plates of the armor's face scowled in response, before brightening into a caricature of a warm smile of welcoming friendship. I holstered my weapon and we made my way towards my original destination, my old office. And we spoke of what had gone on in Tranis in the years since I was recruited, all those ages ago. By the 9 and 4, welcome once more to the library, where today we are going to be taking a brief look at the iconic and long-standing pillar of Jamamar and its many sovereignties within the realms, that of the city-state of Tranis. And as always, my perceptive patrons, this will only be an introduction to this ancient and honored place of learning. To begin with, a brief history. Tranis was founded in the long-forgotten days of the pre-Vansan ages. Originally, it was a royal training academy for the then-growing Domnitra Empire. But after that nation fell to the assault of Vansan, and the capital was lost in the deep and cursed woods that were left behind in that conflict, Tranis remained untouched, unscathed, and unattacked. The reasons for this are still hotly debated to this day. Many think the stringent discipline and order Tranis represented were an anathema to the demon, keeping it away, while others think the military might of the city is what kept the terror at bay. Whatever the reason, Tranis continued to serve as a neutral actor between the remaining powers, training what troops could be gathered for the defense of the nation and what safeholds could be founded during the violent days of the reign. But as the reign ended and the first post-Vansan ages began, Tranis continued to be the finest center of military, civilian, logistic, and intelligence training that could be found on Jamamar, having become our central repository of martial knowledge and lore. As the need of the realms changed and evolved, so have the layers of education and training that Tranis provides, always taking any innovations developed in the field of war and refining their use over centuries of training, testing, and iteration. Generally, most that go to Tranis will do so as a part of their training for their sovereignty's nation guard or other military force, for as in just a year they will be brought up to a high level of skill and ability tailored to the fighting force they will be joining. Only a year in length, it is recognized that this basic training will still elevate most individuals above the realm's average for combat ability and discipline. However, most that are sent to Tranis for longer lengths of time are being sent to be molded into commanders and leaders, either as a non-commissioned officer or as one of the commanders higher up in that hierarchy. Within 3 years, most will have the knowledge and training and experience to perform as a lower ranked non-commissioned officer, whereas by the end of year 5, they are fully capable to fulfill the duties of an officer, albeit a fresh one. It should be noted, however, that each year after 5 can take many years to achieve, even decades, with only prodigy level trainees able to go year for year, and even then, there are less than a handful in all the years that Tranis has existed that have ever made it to a year 9 certification in less than a century, and fewer still that can boast they did it in less than a decade. Very few try or are allowed to train for beyond a year 5 certification, however, as Tranis makes each year after the 3rd increasingly hard to qualify for. It is said that a 9th year Tranis student, the maximum, is equivalent to a dozen of even year 8s, who in turn is worth another dozen 7s, and so on. This level of skill and quality are almost unmatched, as so far as training goes. Of course, there are equivalent masters of war that have never stepped foot within Tranis, but when it comes to be able to train and create such masters of war, only Tranis boasts the ability to take nearly any person and turn them into a lord of conflict reliably and consistently. Full live exercises, magical what-ifs, and many other tools are used to give the trainees as much realistic training time as possible. The staff, all of whom are grizzled veterans themselves, share their hard-earned secrets and show how they are applied to the shock and awe of students eager to learn from these masters of combat and tactics. As well as broad rank and responsibility-based training, Tranis also offers a wide array of specialist-style training: zero-gravity operations, survival in hostile planes, Chris-Tech manipulation and field repair, and undersea combat are but a very few examples of this specialist training. Many of these training courses are only available via sets of recommendations and official dealings, as some of them are very provocative, such as the course in Anti-NLR Tactics and Strategy, or its counterpart, Worm Wasting in You 101. While these courses are completely needed and justified with the past that the realms have had with both of these elder races, and even acknowledged as such by the races in question, Tranis chooses not to advertise them, to preserve some semblance of peace and civility between them and these very powerful races. With the Age of Stars and the massive expansion that's brought on, Tranis continues to teach how best the duties within the 4 war orders are to be executed and performed. The war orders are 4 broad categories of war fighting or conflict management that Tranis specializes in training. To achieve a 9th year level of aptitude within all 4 confers the rarest rank that Tranis can award, that of War Master. The 4 orders are that of civilian operations, logistical operations, intelligence operations, and military operations. Most students that go past a first-year training regime will study and specialize in 1 or 2 of these orders, and receive additional focus on those aspects of the great game that is armed conflict and its myriad variants that apply to those orders. It should also be noted that this training will almost in all cases be slanted based off the nature of the trainees and the available resources of the nation in which they are intended to serve. For example, archers that can place an arrow unseen between the eyes of a bandit king in a deep forest are the meat and potatoes of the elven armed forces, just as wicked and ruthless tunnel fighters are to the dwarves. Tranis teaches all for the duties they are to undertake, so long as the costs for the education are paid. And with this brief look into Tranis and its history, general place within the realms, but before we return to Sergeant Han's visit to this historic place of learning, I wish to thank each and every one of you that has been enjoying and joining us for our exploration. Your time and attention is very much appreciated and valued. Thank you. Now, until you next find your way to the library, my prospective patrons, by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourselves and each other. Now, back to our tale. As I opened the door to my office, magics inside cleared inches of dust and freshened the air that had gone unbreathed for ages, and made it appear as if it was the day I had left. Kanar followed me in, sliding the door closed and waving his hand, causing the walls to glow in a million or so pinpricks of light as he sealed the room so we could speak in private. After all these years, what brings you back? You've been hiding out in Gavain ever since you retired. If you weren't going to come back then, why now? I let my shock show. I hadn't considered Kanar would have tried to keep up with me after so long. What? After you were recruited for Criterion, I tried to keep up with your exploits, only for you to vanish a few decades later. Let me guess. Covert operations? I nodded. Either way, You asked me to keep an eye on your things, and thus keeping up with you was required. No reason to do so if you're dead, after all. I'm a bit ashamed. Never thought to reach out after I retired. Forgive me, old friend. He waved my words off as if they were a foul smell. I won't hear of it. The Nine Wings sets us all on our own path. Now, what brings you back? Need my kit? Things are afoot, and I am no longer able to remain retired. The look he made was that of shock and disbelief. Things that require equipment of that quality. I drew and I set the rotator pistol on my desk to an immediate and visceral reaction. Not in four. How is that even possible? You said. Worry and not a small bit of fear could be seen, even in his metal face. Believe me, I know, but there it is. The how and why are hidden down a path I must now walk. And if this, picking up the weapon, is where from and whom I believe it is, then the final secret that you've been keeping so well has been discovered or revealed. Not a likely thing to even be possible. He relaxed, understanding that I didn't suspect him of betrayal, but his expression was still filled with concern. Either way, the presence of this, I slid the rotator into the holster at my back, means my old kit is most likely going to be required. At least in the current age, it shouldn't stand out, even to most who think they know what they are looking at. At that, I walked over to the wardrobe and drew out the privacy curtain, before twisting a few of the handles and pressing on a few hidden panels, and opening the main compartment. Now that the extra-dimensional hidden storage areas that were open for the first time since I originally stowed my kit all those years ago. A bench to sit on slid out automatically, and I began to change. I set my weapons on the bench. As I pulled on the bodysuit and then the layers that went over it, I was instantly staggered for a moment, as all the various systems began to heavily draw on my own resources, in order to recharge their long-discharged power banks. A moment later, I was fine, and I finished by adjusting and donning my service pistol holster on my left leg, and then hooking my beater on the right side of my belt. I slid the rotator pistol back to its place on my back, and completed the whole affair by putting on the overcoat. Made of dragon scales and other very rare materials, very heavily enhanced, it provided great combat as well as utility enhancement and functions. I reached one last time into the wardrobe before closing it back up, withdrawing the large case that was used to carry the whole of my kit, as well as to repair and maintain it. Closing the doors caused the bench and the divider to withdraw automatically, and Kanar looked at me in my full raiment, and he softly clapped, the metal-on-metal sound softly ringing through the chamber. Quite the sight, Professor. But allow me. And with a wave of his hand, I saw a soft glow move over me, and the few but unmistakable signs that revealed the truth of my gear's origin were removed, and left me with no mark as to the provenance of this gear. I sighed and relieved the tension I hadn't quite articulated. This was a relief. Many thanks. I hadn't quite figured out that one yet. How long do you have, Professor? I would ask a favor of you before you go. Plus, it would be a good way to make sure your kit is still fully functional. I need to be on my ship no later than 0345, Realm Standard. What do you have in mind? There was mischief in his tone. This should be good. Well, with the significant uptake in hiring of squad, company, and even as large as army-sized formation for use within the wildlands, mostly by various disaffected noble or merchant clans attempting to get a jump on the sovereignties during the colonization hold. There's a bit of a backlog on qualified assessors for higher level certification trials, particularly PCT assessors. You want me to beat the test and evaluate somebody? I think I could oblige. I smiled. Kanar just wanted to see my gear in action. Not someone, in fact. A triad of year 5s going for certs. And it's for their group, PCT. It's their last test, and I think a bit of humility might be needed for them, as they've been on quite the tear through their exams and tests the last 2 years. One of them is actually going to get 5s on all their certs by the completion of this, if the tests hold out. As he opened the door, I began to follow him. My kit case began to float behind us on unseen force. Now let me get that. And let us get to the exam chamber. And I'll be sure to have you home by curfew. The look in his eyes was pure merriment, and we made our way down the hall towards the exam chambers. Several hours later, and a few lessons learned and taught, I was whisked to the airlock outside the ship, with the well wishes of a near-forgotten friend, and a new oath to stay in touch, at least once a decade at the very minimum. Small steps, right? As I crossed into the ship, I found myself being scanned, before Nav's face came up on a nearby screen. Welcome back, Sarge. Shall I have a drone issued to come take your case? Yeah, have it leave it in my quarters. Heading to the lift, take me to the system that needs my attention. As I set the case down and I heard an approaching drone, I made my way to the lift so that Nav could do as I had instructed. Seeing the drone carry the case off, I stepped into the lift, and again saw Nav on the panel. Yes, Nav? Sarge, I have sealed the exosuit section. I understand you would not want the little ones or anyone else aware of what is in there. The captain, LT, Nada, and Mazzy have been kept too busy to have checked or expressed interest. My confusion was clear as Nav continued on. Sarge, it's a standard Class 4 exosuit pod, but the encoding and the material of the pod are not standard by any means. With that, the image shifted to the pod in question, and I felt my nerves shudder cold throughout my body. With a vacant stare, I was finally able to give a response after blinking several times. Nav, you keep things sealed until I come back out of there, and prepare to purge the entire compartment if I call for it, no questions. Until I come out, I want full infosec. No scrying, no video, no audio, nothing. Nav merely nodded before replying. Confirmed, Sarge. Please know you have just under 40 minutes until general roll call. After that, they will come looking for you within an estimated 7.75 minutes. And he was right. I needed to deal with this before the rest of them came looking, and they began to ask questions I still had no answers for. As I stepped onto the suit deck, I noticed it wasn't the standard configuration for this style of ship. It had only one launching port, instead of the 3 it should, as well as only having 2 ship bays. There should be a half dozen or more on a ship like this. And only one of the bays had a pod installed. The pods themselves being a universal standard and system that Criterion had been using since its inception. But this pod was anything but universal. And as I approached, then watched as the interface console slid out of the pod seamlessly, I knew I'd be done in less than 40 minutes. Thus I stepped up and began to confirm both my worst fears and wildest fantasies.